Okay, I'm going to end the poll here as we've got people joined. So, it's good. Got about 54% do know what net zero is. That's good, but glad to have you here as well. 8% don't, and 38% I think so, but don't quiz me. And I think that's really important, because it's easily you know, you can get it wrong. But anyway, welcome to our webinar, Why Net Zero Matters. I'm Sam Cande, CEO of Responsible Futures, a sustainability and social responsibility consultancy. Our consultants specialise in things like carbon footprint measurement, net zero, social value, ESG frameworks and accreditations such as CSRA or B Corp, and can produce impact reports to help with communication and so much more. Today, I'm joined by 3 expert panellists, James Cannings, Michelle Furtado and Ben Knight. We'll hear more about them in a moment. But why does net zero matter? Following the most recent IPCC report, it is scientifically proven that we're on a fast track to climate disaster. The science is clear. To keep to a 1.5 degree limit within reach, we need to reduce global emissions by 45% in the next 8 years and reach net zero by 2050. We must all have a net zero strategy, but it needs to be backed up with measurable and achievable targets. Just yesterday, campaigners announced a legal case against the government's net zero strategy and have secured a High Court hearing. So today, I think it's important that we find out exactly what net zero is and how we're going to get there. But let's start with an introduction to our panellists. James, do you want to kick us off?
Happy to. Yeah, I'll keep it short. I've got lots to get through that I'd love to get through. I'm James Cannings. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at MSQ. So my job is very much focused on our net zero strategy, our measurement, our reduction, our removals, our offsetting, our tree planting. I also spend a lot of time working in the sphere of digital carbon footprints. How do we make sure we build low carbon digital footprints and marketing platforms? I'm the co-chair of the BIMA Sustainability Council, through which I open source all my work, both through digital footprints, but I'm also the author of a course called How to Measure, Reduce and Offset your company's carbon footprint. So yeah, it's my day job. What a lovely day job it is.
And my business partner Karen is sharing all the links in the chat, so please click on the links if you want to save them after. We will send them out following the webinar too. And Ben, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invite to be here. So I'm Ben. I'm Head of Sustainability at GoCardless. So some of you might have heard of us, but we are a global fintech. We've got over sort of 70,000 customers now across the world, and we move about $30 billion of money each year. So relatively small company, around 800 employees, but we have a big sort of sphere of influence in terms of our customers, our employees, and our suppliers as well. So yeah, so like James, I've got a absolutely brilliant day job. I look after our sustainability, which is all about how do we reduce our impact, but also how do we create positive change as a business, whether that's for climate or also nature and communities. And yeah, I guess outside of my day job, the reason why I do sustainability is, I've got a couple of kids, and I'm really just want to make sure that they live in a more sustainable world, which I think is probably what everyone is probably here for as well. So yeah, thanks for the invite.
Good to have you here. And Michelle, over to you.
Hi everyone, so my name is Michelle Potardo. I am a sustainability consultant, an artist and an activist. I do a lot of volunteering with community climate people and environmental people as well. So that's kind of my background, is around ecosystem services and biodiversity type things. But then I've done, do a lot of work with local governments around looking at how they can tackle sustainability in kind of area-based terms. So yeah, it's my bag, I live it, I love it. And again, I've got a couple of children and I want them to have a beautiful future. So.
Welcome and good to have you here. So I mentioned before about the IPCC report, and for people like us, you know, we're very aware of what's going on. It can be quite scary to a lot of people. I want to really sort of know what your initial views are on the climate crisis. And, you know, we say that we've got to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. How serious is that? Michelle, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so I kind of have lived this, I suppose, and watched as this world has blossomed in terms of sustainability. We are in a crisis situation. There are lots of forces and structures in the world that make that very complex for people. And because of that fear as well, which I think we feel as humans, it can make us, it can make us not want to, or not feel like we're able to take the right amount of action because it's so massive and complex. So I think a lot of my work now is how we can kind of transform a conversation from around sustainability, which is sustaining where we're at the moment, to actually being a more regenerative culture and actually having a future that's looking really bright, because there are so many futures that are possible. It's finding and carving out the pathways to, you know, have those really good long-term futures that humanity can blossom and really fulfill our potential.
Thank you. James, what about you? Do you think we're doing enough? Are we going to get there?
We're not doing enough. I mean, I'm wildly optimistic. I mean, I think most, well, not most people are, but, you know, I am quite optimistic that as a species we can do these kind of incredible things, and I think it's really changed over the last 10 years. You know, there's huge amounts of, you know, money going into this. There's huge kind of win-wins for businesses. Now there's a whole other panel debate around whether kind of capitalism can solve the problem that it's created, and you know, but I think you kind of have to believe that that's going to happen. I think, you know, my course, I don't like to sort of start with the fear too much and sort of bang that into people, partly because actually behavioral scientists will tell you it doesn't actually work. I mean, I think you're right, Michelle, but actually there almost isn't enough fear. I think we could all agree that if it was a meteorite crashing to Earth in the next couple of years, we'd probably be doing stuff about it. But our sort of basic monkey brains don't, they're very, very good at dealing with lions. And so public messaging like hands, face, space, which we'll all remember from the pandemic, actually is quite effective, because a pandemic is quite like a lion, you know, it's right now, but you might die in 80 years, or your kids might not have a planet to live on, actually isn't actually a very compelling argument for systemic kind of change. So one of the facts, you know, there's all sorts of sort of horrifying statistics about the financial cost. You know, I sort of try and remind people that it is here now. Go and look up the Holocene extinction event. It's the 6th mass extinction event. 4 out of the previous 5 were climate related. It's not about preventing an extinction level event. It's about mitigating the one that we are scientifically in now. We just tend to forget that we're not the only species on the planet. Some models show that up to 200 species of plant, mammals, birds become extinct every 24 hours because of the ecosystems that are unraveling. So I don't know, sometimes that's more of a motivator. Like, it isn't 80 years, there's work to do, but it's right now, it's really bad. We are in an extinction level event, but I don't like to sort of lead with the fear too much.
Yeah,
maybe it's not my nature.
Yeah, and I think, you know, look, we'll go through fears in this webinar, and we'll hopefully sort of pull out some positives and things that we can do as well. I can see that people put in some things in the chat. We are going to get into the details of what everything means, and but if you have any questions, please use the Q&A, because then, you know, the chat sometimes goes quite fast, but with the Q&A I can just pick the questions and see them, and we will get to questions and answers in the end. But just from your point of view, Ben, on your views on the climate crisis, what do you think personally?
Yeah, I think, like Michelle and James, I think I am an optimist, but I think there's a huge amount of hard work to do to get there. I think what's been quite good over the last few years, there's certainly been a lot of movement, and certainly within the sort of the business sector as well. But I think, James, your point on the Holocene, and then the fact we're now in the Anthropocene, is still quite an important thing for us to bear in mind. I think that the context that sometimes I set with my colleagues is that currently humanity is now using 1.75 Earths to provide our resources and absorb our waste, including our greenhouse gases, which is clearly far off being sustainable and a way off being regenerative, to your point, Michelle, which is where we need to be. But then I think also what I've seen is then that business case which is coming about where, yes, we know that we need to do it at the global level, but I think people are starting to see the other reasons behind it, whether that's financial, whether that's talent resourcing, recruiting, that sort of thing. Also on the customer side, the revenue side, I think businesses are starting to move for those other reasons as well, which is good. But from a personal point of view, I'm optimistic we are going to get there. But I mean, I think the IPCC report also said we have 3 years to reach peak emissions by 2025, which is not far off. So that urgent action now in reductions, aside from everything else, reducing those emissions now is the most important thing, which is why I'm glad that we've already mentioned the word reduce quite a few times already.
Yeah, and I hope it's going to be mentioned far more. I think it's one thing about these webinars, especially ones that I go to, sometimes I think there's conversations that people don't always understand the terms. So I like to do a little bit of jargon busting. So we're going to go round and hopefully this will help the audience. James, let's start with you. What is net zero?
It's a great one, isn't it? It's hilarious. I mean, it's one of the most well-known used terms in the world. In the UK, I could only kind of compare it to Brexit, but unlike Brexit, most people would give you a definition of Brexit in some form. It's separating from the EU or whatever, and it's great that we've got 54%. I mean, it may be that some of those aren't actually as clear when you drill into it. Sometimes I follow that up with, well, could you really give me a description of the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality? And that requires, we'll get into that, an understanding of offsets, which is a terrible term. I wish we could go back in time. You have to start to understand that offsetting your footprint doesn't actually offset your footprint, that being carbon neutral isn't carbon neutral. I apologize on behalf of my space for these terms that we've got, but look at a global, and then there's, from in terms of net zero, it is a bit complicated, or or can be a bit more complicated. So there's the global definition of it, right, which is we've got, I think it's about 36 billion tons of emissions, and we've got to bring that back into balance. So we've got to either reduce and remove, right? It's not offsetting, but reduce and remove. That's the sort of global macro level, and then you can countries can have a net zero target, which is the boundary of their country, which is a bit of an odd one. One of the reasons that the UK's emissions per head is so low against the US is not because we're brilliant and they buy lots of stuff, but it's because we've decimated our manufacturing base and we buy lots of stuff from China. So that's a bit of an odd one. And then companies, which is perhaps what we're talking about, the definition of net zero for an organization is then when we get into this kind of concept of scope 1, 2, 3, which your electricity, your gas, your supply chain, commute, business travel, all of that sort of stuff. We can, if I'm going too quick on that, that's fine, but it's your full scope of your emissions. Now, we only actually had a definition of that formally from the SBTi at COP last year in October. So we actually have our first formal definition of what net zero means for a company, which is essentially an extension of that 2030 pathway you mentioned, Sam, that 45% reduction. That's really important because we can't backload this. It's effectively, and it changes around for the industries a little bit, a 90% reduction in your absolute emissions by 2050 at the latest, and that's regardless of growth. Okay, so if you triple in size or you triple your output, doesn't matter. It's an absolute reduction of 90%, and the residual 10% has to be removed. That's carbon removals. That is not offsetting. And so that's the net zero definition for an organization. And then as you track back from that 2030 target you're talking about there, Sam, is what they would now call a near-term science-based target. And actually there's a lot of confusion between net zero and near-term SBTs. I'll shut up now, but if you Google, for example, net zero by 2030, unless it's changed in the last week or two, every single one of those results is wrong or misinformed, misunderstood. Top of that list is actually the UK's very own environmental agency, who have got confused between it. But to be fair, prior to October last year, we didn't have a definition, so people were just kind of making it up. Sorry, it's probably a longish answer, but it is such an important one. So I'm glad we kind of led with that, and maybe there's one or two people who answered in that 50% who possibly, you know, didn't quite have as tight a handle on it as well. It's quite easy once you understand it, but I think let's get into the offsetting stuff as well, because I think that's a really important one to understand.
But often, I think you mentioned this as well, James, we get net zero confused with carbon neutrality. Ben, I don't know if you can help us out with carbon neutrality and what that means, what the difference is to net zero.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, because I'm sure we'll come across a lot of suppliers that we may speak to or etc. who have terms when you know they've committed to being carbon neutral, they're committed to net zero. I think, James, to your point on the net zero thing, prior to the SBTi last year, a lot of those corporate net zero targets were things like we'll be net zero by 2030, because before then the definition was still the same. It's reduce your emissions to as close to zero as possible and then remove what's left. But there was no guidance on what is that, how big is the net, basically, and until that guidance came out. So I think over the last few months, you've seen a lot of companies changing their previous commitments on that, which is great. Some haven't. And so I think there's a bit of a blurring of those terms. But carbon neutrality is essentially where you can purchase offsets to balance your emissions each year, and then say, we are carbon neutral for this year. I had a really good analogy of the two, actually, so net zero is kind of like a journey. So it's over time, you're reducing your emissions over time. You have to change a lot of things within your business to get there. Whereas carbon neutrality, you can almost, if you've got the funds to do it, you can go and buy a load of offsets that day and become carbon neutral overnight. And I met someone who said to me also, his business, they could essentially stop that operations for a day and say, hey, we were carbon neutral yesterday because we didn't do anything. Whereas the next day they turn their lights back on and suddenly they're back to emitting. So I think it's that difference between a point in time where you can basically, you can purchase carbon neutrality, whereas net zero is more of a process. So I think when you see people say we've achieved carbon neutrality, I think that should sometimes be phrased as we've purchased carbon neutrality, and there is benefits to those offsets, by the way. I'm not saying there isn't, but then the achievement would be we've achieved a reduction in our emissions, and then eventually we've achieved net zero, as opposed to achieve as a personal point of view. But I think that's really important. So carbon neutrality, you buy those offsets, you're carbon neutral. Net zero, you've reduced emissions over time as close to zero as possible, and then you remove what's less.
Can I do my smoking analogy, Ben?
Oh, I love your smoking analogy. Yeah, go for it.
Just because it's still, I think, can be confusing. My best analogy for offsets is if I don't, but if I smoke 20 cigarettes a day, and there was a student who came along and said, I'm really definitely going to start smoking. I've decided I want to start smoking 20 cigarettes a day. Now, if I spent some money, gave him some money, said, I'll give you some money every year to not smoke, right? That's a good thing to do. That's a nice thing to do. But for me to run around going, well, I used to smoke, but now I'm cigarette neutral, right, is obviously laughable. I mean, there's 20 cigarettes instead of 40. But when you do avoidance offsetting, which does tend to be, you know, protecting forests or investment in renewable energy to help another business not emit as much, that is in the analogy can break down a bit, but that's almost exactly what you are doing, and it's why the term carbon neutral is sort of ridiculous and isn't the answer, and is so fundamentally different to net zero. So I couldn't resist. I do like my smoking analogy. I don't take credit for it. Somebody gave it to me. I wish I could think who it was.
I think, like, it's just been mentioned a lot, and I think that it's really important to talk about offsetting and what offsetting is. Michelle, do you want to explain?
Yeah, so offsetting is where you are taking what you cannot finally remove from that business in terms of your emissions, and you are then putting money into preventing or balancing out those kind of emissions that are left over. So, and like James was saying, you know, a lot of that is around protecting forests, improving the way agriculture is done, and obviously agriculture is a massive kind of emitter of emissions itself. So that looks at how to improve soils and different ways of actually farming and moving away from those kind of vast monocrops that we're seeing, that are ruining soils and limiting the amount of harvest we've got left. And then it is also about putting those renewable technologies in place. So that will be, paying other people to, there are accredited schemes out there, and some of them are really good, and there's lots of them that are really not good, and there's loads and loads of greenwashing that's been mentioned in the chat, so you do have to dig in. But there are, if you look on the Science Based Targets Initiative website, they have tons of resources, they have accredited schemes that they will accept within those processes of accreditation. So, if you're going to go to somewhere to actually look for where you can do, or what schemes you should be putting your offsetting money into, if you want to go down that pathway, then go and actually dig deep, find the right people, and find the right organisations, and pull that out of the hat. So it's there.
Yeah.
It's to be kind of looked at carefully.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you there. And I think that a lot of people are making statements at the moment with marketing where they're saying, look, come and emit with us and we'll offset on your behalf, and it's almost like it makes it okay. And I think that it's so important to be planting trees and biodiversity, and but saying that we'll do this and it's still okay and we can just carry on, I think that's where it gets a little bit wrong. A couple of more terms I just wanted to cover before we go a bit further into how you get to net zero. You mentioned there, Michelle, science-based targets. Do you want to explain, or SBTIs as it's been mentioned before, what that actually is?
Yeah. Well, it's a kind of global accreditation scheme, for want of a better word, and it's worked with by there's the World Resources Institute in there. There's a UN Global Compact, WWF, and they've got the great and the good, and they've got these robust, measurable pathways. There are different sectoral pathways that you can find, and it has got. So it was originally the kind of keeping to the 1.5 degrees, or moving towards the 1.5 degrees, so aligned with the Paris climate targets effectively. But then the net zero, they've just released that kind of accreditation, that guidance, and that is rapid decarbonisation now. So that's the 45% by 2030. It's not long, and then we're going to have that 90-95% deep cuts by that 2050 at the very latest. So that's what people everywhere should be working towards, because it's understood, it's robust. There's loads of, it takes into account the greenhouse gas protocols and all the other brilliant pieces of science work that underlay those kind of accreditation services. And there are lots of other optional accreditation things out there, but they should all be moving and aligning themselves with that bigger piece of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, if anyone who's with us today, if anyone has any other terms that we mention and you want to know what it means, please feel free. If you don't feel comfortable sharing it publicly, if you message privately, then we'll make any explanations, because I want these webinars, I want people to understand all these terms so they can go away and actually start doing what they need to do. But let's get into it a little bit here. To get to net zero, to get to carbon neutrality, you have to measure your carbon emissions, right? So how do you go about that, James?
It's still trickier than it should be. It's getting easier. It's a combination of some very, very complex science, and people have worked out all the different emissions factors of different products that you buy, or emissions from vehicles that you work out, with a lot of rather scary, when you get into it, extrapolations, guesstimates, averages, and there's a lack of standards. So Ben and actually supported me. We both kind of use spreadsheet based models, and GoCardless have sort of built their one online. Hopefully they'll share that tool as well. But you know, you look, you can jump on my course. I don't want to over promote it, but if you haven't started, and certainly if you're an SME, there's a free spreadsheet based tool on my course that I've developed over years. But I also call out, and there's a growing list. There's probably at least 50 plus SaaS platforms that I'm aware of, and there's new ones coming out every month because there's so much money in this, and people are jumping on the bandwagon. My suggestion on the course is that if you kind of step through a simple, oh, there you go, thank you, Ben, there's that calculator. But if you step through my simple spreadsheet, you'll at least go through the process of, you know, understanding it, grabbing the data that you need from surveys, from your finance teams. I've got some quick, simple ways of sort of using spend-based modeling. The one that scares people is kind of supply chain, like how do we measure the emissions from all of the goods and services that we buy? Well, actually, year one, you can, if you know how much money you spend, and finance teams are very good at that, you can put that blob in and just get an order of magnitude. If you measure your carbon footprint with 10 different calculators that are on the market, my spreadsheet included, you'll get 10 different footprints. You know, they're all over the place. The emissions factors from different industries are averaged and estimated, and what people call IT isn't always what we mean by IT, and whether it includes cloud services or not. Like it's really complicated. Particular to SMEs, and we do need better standards, but I actually tend to say, look, don't worry about it too much. If you can just get a rough order of magnitude, you know, to me, that day one pie chart of going electricity, gas, you know, commuting, you know, that kind of realization that, you know, electricity and gas was like 9%, and because the measurement piece informs the strategy. Where are the quick wins for my businesses? What can I go after today to reduce that? Oh, right, we need an electric vehicle scheme. We need to get our staff onto renewable energy. We've got to switch. You know, it's the measurement that drives the strategy. Like with anything in business, if you haven't got KPIs, you can't measure it, you can't do anything about it. Over time, your measurement may change and you may have to go back. I'm often rebasing because my 2019 base was missing things, and I've developed, you know, etc. And that's okay. It is a little bit the Wild West. Standards will come because, yeah, you know, if you compare two footprints from two different companies, you know, unless they're using an identical tool, there's going to be discrepancies. So it used to be horrendously complicated that I found to my cost and developed my own tools, but through things like my course, lots and lots of SaaS platforms, depending on your budget, there are tools out there, you know, to help you sort of get going quickly, even if it's a rough order of magnitude. And kind of I wouldn't stress about that too much, especially if you're an SME.
Yeah, so, you know, for SMEs, they just need to start by measuring using simple Excel spreadsheets, as you say, and it's just as you get further into it, then it gets more complex. Then there are plenty of tools out there, and there are plenty of people out there that can help if you don't, you know, if you don't have the people to do it yourself. So you know, I hope that has helped. What about actually setting a net zero target? Michelle mentioned before 2030, 2050, but you know, some people might not even be in their jobs in those times. How do we then go about setting a net zero target, and when do we do it by?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to be kind of, it's hard, isn't it? Because you're going to look at your business and you're going to think, oh, okay, this could be, you know, monstrous. And it's difficult times at the moment in terms of, you know, global supply chains. And there are lots of other complexities that are kind of layered onto this sustainability work. So, you know, set the target for 2050. And if you can bring that forward, brilliant. And that's absolutely fine. And, you know, mirroring what James is saying, it doesn't need to be stressful. It doesn't need to be difficult. You need to just say, this is our commitment. This is the direction we want to go. You tell all your staff, you get them to start funneling ideas and work and how we can kind of bring, you know, reduce down our emissions, and what processes we can make more efficient, how we can actually encourage, you know, our suppliers and our staff and our customers to actually live in a more sustainable fashion themselves. So it's about getting the messaging right, and, you know, and bringing in and getting that enthusiasm and setting your goals as there. So you can have that 2050 target, and that's great. And then if you're, you know, a small, medium-sized enterprise, they might be able to kind of reduce significantly their emissions just by choosing to have a renewable energy supplier. You know, if that hasn't already done, that could be done next week, kind of thing. So actually there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, which can be done, and then it's, you know, getting into the nitty-gritties going forward. I think a lot of there are disruptive technologies and there are disruptive kind of practices that are coming on board. Someone mentioned in the chat kind of circular economies. There are lots of partnerships being built, and they can be local, global, national, whatever it kind of the means is to move us in the right direction. These are happening. So it's about, you know, building that knowledge for yourselves, and then looking at everything in your company through that lens of climate change, and starting to understand exactly we've measured and we can start reducing now. So the measurement doesn't need to be horrific, but if you've got, you know, the funding to throw at it, then definitely really dig deep into what your practices are doing.
Yeah, thanks for that. Ben, you have gone to net zero. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience in doing that and how you did it and what you did? And, you know, that might help other people, whether any company can do it, whether you're large or small. But do you want to tell us a bit more about actually going through the process?
Yes, yeah. So just to clarify, we haven't got to net zero yet. We're a long way off. But yeah. So I actually completely agree with James and Michelle. Actually, is that the most important thing I think on that process is the measurements initially, because until you understand that, I mean, a lot of statements I see, again, some of our supply chain when we're doing our supply chain measurements is we are a digital company or we're a media company. We therefore don't have much of an environmental impact, which is a bit of a bit of a head in your sand sort of moment, because a lot of people think that your environmental impact as a business would be, you know, as a steel maker or an aviation company or that sort of thing. But every company has to do something and therefore uses energy and uses resources in some way. So, I mean, for us, we're a digital tech company, so 99.6% of our emissions are in what's known as scope 3, which is our indirect emissions. But that's still things like home working, which is a massive one for us. So commuting, our purchase goods and services, our supply chains, our cloud services, also how our customers use our services as well, because that's part of those emissions. So we have to do those measurements first off, and I'll put a link to our climate reports. I'm happy for anyone to take those, plagiarize those. They go into a lot of detail, which might be really useful for other businesses for doing that. But then in terms of setting those net zero targets, once we knew what those big areas were, we could then straight away look to how do we decarbonize rapidly. So a prime example is home working, which there was a common theme sort of post-COVID that the switch to home working was good for the environment because people were commuting less. But actually for us, so commuting was around between 20 and 30 tons per year, whereas our home working is close to 1,000. So to put that into some context, and that's basically because you take people out of a relatively well energy efficient insulated building and put everyone into distributed, especially in the UK, quite leaky homes using gas boilers. That's quite a big amount of impact. So for us, we could see that home working was in our top 5. So straight away, we've been rolling out smart power bars, electric radiators, that sort of thing, to help us, one, decarbonize, but also help our employees save energy bills and that sort of thing. Some other things we've been looking at is measuring our customer use of energy, helping our customers then move to renewables and that sort of thing. But those measurements initially then, like James said, then set out your strategy. And so for us, we set a near-term science-based target of 2027, which for us is an 82% reduction per employee because we're quite a high growth business. And then we've got 2035 net zero target. But those next 5 years are the really important things. That's where we really try and decarbonize home working. We've just set out a sustainable travel policy because we're international business, so putting essentially a carbon budget on travel, so we're reducing travel per year is really important. And then the big part is working with our supply chain. So at the moment we're going through measuring in a lot more detail our supply chain, which sounds complicated, but it's actually relatively easy. If you've got a supplier, if they publish their emissions, which, okay, it might not be massively accurate, but if you've got that data and you've got their revenue and you know how much you spend with them, you can work out your related emissions from that quite quickly. I know it sounds like a complex accounting thing, but it's relatively simple to do. And and other things from that. You're commuting. Can you do cycle to work schemes? Like James said, I think James has done the EV scheme as well. There's all sorts of things you can do quite quickly. We've just worked on a small pilot project with someone called the Big Clean Switch, who I highly recommend. So for scope 2 energy use outside of our control, so a lot of businesses might use WeWork type buildings where it's you can't choose who that energy supplier is. So what we did was we measured all of that energy use, and then we've purchased renewable energy on behalf of that. So where we can't choose it, we've just bought that energy instead. So there's a lot of things you can do in the short term, but then a lot of it takes a lot longer, hence our 2035 target.
Oh, you're doing so much. I'm quite interested. You mentioned about the carbon travel budget. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we knew what our travel had to look like over the next 12, 13 years. So where we are, or where we are in 2019, and where we need to get to per employee by 2035, and just working back from that. So this is going to sound quite detailed, but we built a science-based target tool. It's an Excel spreadsheet which shows that emissions reductions over time. From there, I then worked out essentially the carbon budget per year per employee. So it took a bit of work on that, but essentially, we've said to our employees things like, one, do you need to travel at all? Because I think COVID has shown that for a lot of times you don't need to travel, and also it's about inclusivity as well, because a lot of people might not be able to travel. So if you've got a big team meeting and you say, right, we're all going to meet in, I don't know, San Francisco, that might not be particularly inclusive for people who might be carers or have family commitments, etc., and things like that. But do you need to travel? Can you reduce the distance? Can you meet halfway, for example? If you do need to travel, can you prioritize using low emissions? So we've got an office in France, for example, so we only allow employees to take the Eurostar, and we incentivize that by allowing them to travel in premium, I think it is, whereas if they did fly, they can only go in economy. So trying to incentivize low emissions transport wherever possible, and also where people do fly, they can only fly direct. So again, that reduces those emissions from going indirect. And we've incentivized reductions of travel class as well. So if someone reduces their travel class, then we assign a carbon budget to that, which goes into environmental projects at the end of the year. So there's all sorts of levers that you can put together as part of a travel plan. And then for our next financial year, again, sorry, this is very detailed, we're tying the carbon budget to the financial budget as well. So when we say to a team, this is your budget for travel this year, it is directly linked to carbon as well.
Yeah, I think these kind of things moving forward are really going to help companies to develop. And, I've worked in business travel for 7 years, and I believe in face-to-face meetings. But I think that question of, do you have to travel? Somebody asked me to go to a meeting the other day, and I was like, actually, can we make it a virtual meeting this time, because we only just met recently? So, I really think that's important, that there are times when you need to travel, but actually just thinking about the reason. Not everyone's going to be able to get to net zero, but companies want to be more sustainable. James, there's no sort of laws around getting to net zero at the moment for companies, but are there other things that companies can do?
Well, actually, it is a legal requirement. As a UK company, you are obligated to get to net zero by 2050. Effectively, I don't think anyone's going to get arrested, but that effectively is what we've all kind of signed up to.
Companies of all size?
Yeah, we have to get to net zero by 2050, and probably not of all sizes, but of most UK limited companies, there is an obligation to do this, and all companies can get there, absolutely, and all companies need to get there. What I think that, again, it's just what they could do today is get to carbon neutrality. What I would say is I'd say that no company can achieve net zero today. Someone will say, well, I'm one person and I've got like tiny emissions, and if probably not by the SBTi's definition, but if you use carbon removals like direct air capture, which can be up to £1,000 per tonne, but if you threw a lot of money at it in that generic definition of net zero, you probably could be net zero today. We can't achieve net zero today, partly because even if we all threw the money at the removals, that hasn't scaled yet. Like, we haven't scaled that technology. One of the reasons it's a 90% reduction from the SBTI is because we cannot rely on removal technology. Part of the optimism within me is that these removal offsets, like, and I wish they weren't called removal offsets because it makes it confusing with other types of offsets, but you know, direct air capture, permanent carbon capture, those types of things, if we can scale those, and one of the things we're doing at the moment, alongside a lot of the strategies that Ben talked about and staff schemes and things like that, is starting to invest in carbon removals, just to remove our scope 1 and 2, use some budget where we can. One way to think about that is kind of front loading the net in net zero. So we know we've got to get rid of that last bit. We can kind of start investing in that now, and if we do that now, it's great. You know, there's good PR and marketing, and it looks good as an organization, but I'm doing it to help really raise awareness of what are removals, and if we invest in those types of technology, then we can scale it. There's no reason that net zero couldn't be redefined by the SBTI in 8 years' time to say, actually, a 60% reduction is acceptable, you know, as long as you hoover out the other 40%. But there has to be enough capacity in the system for that to be possible, and right now there isn't. So, and sorry, just in terms of, you know, we're about to have a net zero target. We don't have one yet, and that's, well, actually partly because the SBTI didn't really allow you to sign up to officially have those until last October, and we're just going through that. So we'll be one of the first to have the official one. But I would do it in reverse order. The first thing that we did was made a pledge to halve our footprint per head by 2026, because I was like, that I can see that time frame and I can put an actual plan in place to do that. The next most important thing was our near-term science-based target. That was a pledge, but I can also realistically see how it looks quite challenging, but I'm pretty certain I can hit that by 2030. As I said to our CEO at the time, I said, look, Pete, just so you're clear, like our net zero target, which is going to be 2040, amazing for Ben to go for 2035, brilliant. I mean, but I said, it's science fiction, Pete. It's a pledge. I have no plan, strategy, ability to do this. It relies on, I can see how it's possible, but it requires the grid emissions factor. So the amount of renewable energy in every country in which we operate to be, a certain point. It requires public transport infrastructure to be running on green energy. It requires our entire supply chain to have pretty much done the same thing. And it's not that I can't see how it's possible, but it's like, it's a pledge and whatever. But the most important thing is, what am I doing this year? Am I on track for my 2024 target? Which means I'll be on track for my 2030 target. And that's the way to break it down. So by all means, start with a net zero pledge. Brilliant. You can do it tomorrow, because you don't really have to do a lot of modeling and thinking, because it's it's pretty impossible. Start with that, but I'd kind of go the other way. Like, if you can measure, like, what can you do this year? What can you do in 2 years? Set the near-term target, kind of work in that direction. Did I even answer the question? I don't know. I just waffled on, but maybe there was some nuggets in there.
You did.
Did I? Okay, I forgot what the question I was answering was.
There were some good nuggets in there. Thank you. I'm going to switch to some of the questions. I've got some more questions, but the questions are just coming in thick. So someone's asked, how important is or will the circular economy be to achieving net zero? I love the circular economy, and I think that there's some really good examples of companies that are doing a lot there. Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's no reason just to say one pathway is going to be right. I think, you look at donut economics, you look at circular economies, you look at degrowth to a point in terms of not having to advertise so much stuff to people to buy. I think all of these are going to be useful strategies for our society, global society, to actually achieve sustainability now, but regenerative future. And I think that's important. You can't looking at one singular thing and going, that is the way forward. It kind of it diminishes all the other options, and there will be options in future that have the potential to totally disrupt the energy sector, for example, or totally disrupt how transport is, how we get from A to B, or even the pandemic, as it were, what that has actually done in our ability to be able to actually meet people. I live in Portugal. Hello, I'm in Portugal now. We have got people from all around the world who have plugged into this webinar and actually it's a really useful way to actually have these conversations and build this knowledge capacity. So circular economy is brilliant. I think if you can also use your knowledge and influence in your local areas to seek what is out there already and find out who is working on what agendas, what your local governments are doing, whether there is a local sustainability partnership, whether that can think about how partnerships can be developed to implement some aspects of circular economies in the local area. I think all of these threads is going to weave a beautiful future. And I think so it's not about limiting our options, it's about seeing and embracing all the different potential solutions that we have in front of us.
Thank you. I love it when I see sort of new ways, new ideas, new technologies coming out that help us to with the circular economy and, you know, to recycle. Actually, somebody asked very early on, and I'd like to ask it now, will recycling do more harm than good? Does anyone have any answers on that, James?
Well, I wanted to touch on a point because Emma's made a good point there about, you know, 45% of carbon reductions need to come from the circular economy, and I don't necessarily distinguish them in that way. In that, you know, to a certain degree, sort of CO2e is almost your kind of lowest common denominator. Everything we dig out of the ground creates emissions in order to do that, and so we can measure everything, or we can just keep life simple and measure CO2e. So that's the point of scope 3. If you're focused on just scope 1 and 2, which nobody really should be anymore, maybe unless you're, you know, big energy giant, but if you're focusing on your scope 3 emissions, then the definition of that requires you to be looking at how you're sourcing, how you're manufacturing, how your products are sold and distributed and sent upstream. It kind of is the circular economy. So the two things are intertwined as long as you're measuring and reducing your scope 3 emissions. And yeah, you can measure it in different ways, but I think CO2 or CO2e that we use, it just is a helpful, simple metric. And I think if we can only get to net zero if we live in a more circular economy. They're very intertwined. Recycling, not my area of expertise, actually. You know, we're a professional services business, a bit like Ben. So it's not an area I've looked at hugely because, you know, we produce professional services, digital products and services. Our recycling is important, but it's people putting stuff in the waste bins. We're not a big manufacturer where we have to kind of be very concerned about how the products that we deliver are being recycled. To Ben's point earlier, you know, scope 3 of course includes, it's not just the products that we buy, it's products and services. So we still have huge scope 3 emissions in HR, IT, admin, legal, all the kind of third-party services that we purchase, but those don't require recycling. So I couldn't give a good answer. I don't doubt that, yeah, recycling technology, someone called it wish, there's a lot of wish cycling. I think we all wish cycle, right? We all just I do it, like loads of stuff in the recycling that part of me knows that I don't think that can be recycled. And so yeah. I wouldn't claim to be
or where it actually ends up. I
yeah,
had really,
exactly. Yeah,
good conversation with Stone Group actually recently on my podcast, and they were saying that, you know, with IT equipment, companies are saying that it's being recycled and then seeing it in landfill. And you know, so I think we just have to be really aware with recycling and know exactly where it's going when we're working with recycling plants. There was a question from Emma to you, Ben, about dealing with the increased cost of public transport versus driving, flying. We've gone up to £100 to fill up your car. It's got to the point where it's almost becoming too expensive to drive, which I suppose is a good thing in a way to reduce driving. But what are your thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, if I could just quickly touch on the recycling one, if that's okay.
Yeah,
before.
please do,
there, because we've just actually developed some guidance for our employees on suppliers, supply chains, and it also ties into waste as well, because the first question we ask people is, do you need it in the first place? And I think so recycling should probably be the last resort. So it's like, do you need something? Can you reuse it? Can you repair it? That sort of thing, that mentality of consumer behavior ahead of that. And something that shocked me recently on food waste specifically is that 1 in every 3 mouthfuls is wasted. And if food waste was a country, it would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, because food waste going into landfill produces methane, which is massively much heavier than CO2. So I think there's a big part to play in consumer behavior, and that recycling part is the last resort. But just quickly on that, on the cost of travel, transport, driving and flying. So from a business point of view, so most of our commuting, interestingly, most people use public transport for our commuting anyway. We've got something called adaptive working, so people go to the office as much or as little as they need to, which is fantastic. I appreciate not every business can do that. So for us, there's no associated costs, I guess, in the difference between people driving or taking the train, because it's that personal choice. But I think in terms of, for example, that the example of London to Paris, for, if I was going to Paris tomorrow, it may well be more expensive to take the Eurostar as opposed to flying, because sometimes flying is ridiculously cheap. But still, our priority is, in that instance, the environmental takes precedent over financial. So that's still our preference. And actually, next week I've got to go to the Dublin Tech Summit. So I'm taking a train to London, a train from London to Holyhead, then the ferry across, which is probably 3 times more expensive financially than flying, but it's about 1/10 of the carbon emissions. So and that's our policy, which is great. Which I hope that answered the question, Emma. I think I just waffled, but.
Thanks. Some good points there as well. What about it's back at you for this one, Ben, but getting, you've obviously committed to doing a lot, but getting your people on board, and someone speaks about how do you get companies, SMEs to start doing something. How did you get your people on board, Ben? How did you get them to say, yes, we want to do this as well, and we're happy to support you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm very, very lucky at GoCardless, because it's very much a value-driven business. So one of our main values is care deeply. So when we're talking about sustainability, whether that's climate change or biodiversity or diversity and inclusion or well-being, the idea of caring deeply for people is the why behind it. Because if you don't care for your customers and your employees, or you don't care about your family, friends and your neighbors, then you won't take action on climate. So it's a very, very easy thing to communicate, I think. But there's a lot of things we've been doing internally. So I do constant sort of town hall updates to the team to keep everyone really sort of up to date on what we're doing. We're very transparent and open about progress. I've got a group of volunteers now, about 30 globally, who get involved as much as they can. They get rewarded by giving training and things like that on sustainability. But we also do a lot of events, both internally and externally, to really try and sort of boost engagement, whether that's workshops. And we had a sustainability week a few weeks ago where we send all our teams out on environmental days, where they get they can go out in their local communities and volunteer and literally get their hands dirty in some instances. And that's really important, so that they can get engaged, but also they see that what they're doing matters. So we're just running a survey at the moment, actually, where we're getting everyone's feedback and ideas. And then if there's good ideas, we implement them, and they can show that their voice counts, which is really important. I think in terms of other businesses, so we were one of the co-founders of the Tech Zero Coalition, which is around 300 businesses, I think, now all committed to climate action. And that's I think for me, collaboration is probably the most important thing in the business community, because no business, no individual, but no one can get to net zero by themselves. And it's all about working together, because we're all dependent on other businesses. We're all interconnected. And as humans, we're interconnected with the world around us, and we're dependent on nature and all the things that nature provides us. And so you have to work with others. So I think something we're trying to do, we run a lot of workshops to help other businesses. I think to the point on SMEs, I think it's 90% of SMEs don't measure their emissions because they don't have the resources or the time or the money to do so. So a lot of our customers are SMEs, so we allow them to come to free workshops where we sit down with them, we come up with action plans and things like that. So I think there's a role to be said there for other businesses to help their supply chains and their customers, because we're, again, all dependent on each other. So I think that collaboration piece is really, really important. And also, we're part of Tech Zero, but there's loads of initiatives out there like that where I think I'm on a sustainability WhatsApp group with about 300 people in it, and that's constantly pinging all the time. So just collaboration is the key, I think.
I think that's how we met,
absolutely.
Ben. I think that's how we met, through that. But and the only thing I'd add on to that, I mean, you know, I'd say MSQ are a pretty purpose-driven business, but not I don't think to that extent. But also, I would say why I feel kind of optimistic is actually for the businesses that perhaps aren't as kind of necessarily ethical as that. You know, there's this huge win-win, or there's a huge risk for them if they don't do this sort of stuff. It's not just about being able to sell more sustainable products and services, and there's loads of data and surveys coming out all the time about how people want to make more ethical, sustainable purchases. Tick, absolutely, you've got to do that, otherwise you're going to fail as a business. But also it's about attracting and retaining talent. It's not cool to come out of university at the moment and go and work in the fossil fuel sector. They are struggling to attract good talent, and the same is true of the business. So if you want to sort of take a cynical view, or find a way to get a board who are maybe a bit focused on this year's numbers to take action, and actually a lot are. It's quite an easy sell to the C-suite these days. You know, there's a really kind of obvious investment case for reducing churn, onboarding talent, finding great talent, as well as selling your products and services. So I don't think it's just the domain of the value-driven, purpose-driven, ethical businesses. It's great that they're, you know, leading the way, because what that does is it drives the they succeed more, and it, you know, if you don't keep pace with them, that's great. It's an important part of it. But that win-win, I think, is you know, much more there than it was 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, companies are really struggling with attrition at the moment. I was speaking to someone the other day. They just can't work it out that, you know, and doing things like being more sustainable, being more socially responsible, it's going to keep your staff there. It's really important. We're coming to an end now. I always run out of time, there's more questions to be answered. We will do a follow-up. We will answer the questions that haven't been answered. And, you know, I just want one more sort of, if you could say one thing, getting to net zero, what would be your go away and do this now, from each of the panelists? Michelle, start with you.
Yeah, I say just kind of, right, you've done the webinar today, you're going to go back into your company and you're going to say, okay, I believe we need to get there. This is our commitment now. And you're going to take that first step. And then there are loads of different resources and ways to actually achieve that going forward. So, and we've all got your back.
Absolutely. James?
Off mute. Well, let's have a third plug for my free course. That helps you. I mean, I think there
Definitely.
are, what I wouldn't necessarily say is but please don't spend 6 months measuring your footprint. There's stuff you can do now to do that in parallel. But I mean, Michelle mentioned it, you know, switch to renewable energy. There's probably some quick win staff schemes. Have you got Cycle to Work? Have you got the Octopus, like we use the Octopus EV electric vehicle lease hire scheme, to make it really cheap for everybody to buy electric vehicles? Sign up to things like the military pledge, do some offsetting if you want. I'm not completely anti that, or some removals, like just do a bunch of stuff tomorrow, you know, while you kind of measure things. So yeah, I think it's, you know, and it's those incremental steps, and, you know, don't worry too much about how overwhelming net zero looks and supply chain emissions and things like that. But there are things you can do tomorrow, and there's a very compelling business case to do them.
And Ben?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Do something, if not today, because it's nearly 12 o'clock here in the UK, but definitely do something tomorrow. And that's not the metaphorical tomorrow, which could be after 2030. Literally do something tomorrow. Every business can do something. I think on my list for tomorrow is we're sending out our smart energy bars, for example, to our home workers to help them reduce their energy at home. But yeah, so, and I'd probably just say, I put a link to our sustainability hub in the chat. Please download and plagiarize our sustainability and net zero action plan, because there's things in there that every business can do, from waste to home working to commuting and things like that. And my other thing that I probably always bang on about, I think James heard me says, is that don't forget the other elements of sustainability, because it's not just about carbon and carbon equivalents. So we have to think about biodiversity and communities in parallel as well, because we are, let's say, all interconnected. So if you can do voluntary offsetting alongside reductions that has a positive impact on biodiversity and communities, then great. that was a long one answer.
No.
Sorry.
It's honestly, guys, it's been brilliant. I really enjoyed this. I hope everyone's got so much out of it. Thank you everyone for joining us, taking the time. Our next webinar takes place on the 7th of July. It's titled The S in ESG, Why Social Value Matters. It's in partnership with Action Funder. We hope you can make it. All of our webinars are free. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do. If we can be of any service, put you in touch with anyone. We're going to send all the links. We're going to send the video to this round to everyone as well. Thank you so much for joining, and hope you all have a good day. Thanks, panelists. It's been brilliant. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sam. It's great fun. Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.